Have you ever actually stopped to wonder how educational systems adapt to the wild, rapid-fire changes happening inside a kid's brain and body between the ages of 8 and 12? I was digging into the research for this explainer, and I stumbled across how the Peruvian educational system handles this exact challenge. Honestly, it's kind of mind-blowing. The way they map their teaching strategies directly onto these biological milestones it's a fascinating intersection where high-level policy meets the gritty, everyday reality of developmental psychology. So we're going to unpack this together, looking at the ingenious ways educators literally build a developmental bridge for students crossing over from childhood into early adolescence.
Because, the sheer scope of what happens to a human being in just a few short years is incredible. We start off on the solid, predictable, concrete ground of grade 4. But then, within just 2 years, we inevitably cross into the transformative and, let's be totally honest, kind of chaotic, early adolescent years of grades 5 and 6. The way a child processes the world completely shatters and rebuilds itself in this tiny little window. So we're going to bridge that gap today and discover exactly how educators are trained to walk students safely and productively right across it.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. First, framing the Peruvian learner. Second, Cycle 4, concrete consolidation. Third, Cycle 5, operational mastery. Fourth, the puberty threshold. And finally, classroom strategies for growth. All right, let's just jump right in. Section 1, framing the Peruvian learner, the CNEB philosophy. To really get this approach, we got to grasp the core of the CNEB. That stands for the Currículo Nacional de la Educación Básica. And what I found absolutely fascinating here is that it completely flips traditional education on its head. This isn't just some rigid list of facts kids need to memorize for a standardized test. Not at all. It's a deeply competence-based framework that actually works backward from an ideal exit profile. Think of it less like, filling a bucket with water, and more like handing a kid a highly specific set of tools. It treats students as active agents. They aren't passive sponges just absorbing lectures. They're expected to actively construct their own knowledge through direct, messy, real-world interaction with their physical, social, and cultural environments. Now, the Peruvian primary education timeline spans 6 grades, and they brilliantly break this down into 2-year developmental cycles. Cycle 3 tackles the youngest learners. But our main focus today, this critical transitional corridor we're zeroing in on, is the shift from Cycle 4, which is 8 to 9-year-olds, over into Cycle 5, covering ages 10 to 12. And look, if you've ever spent any time around middle schoolers, you already know this jump isn't just a simple step up in grade level. It is a massive, totally unpredictable leap, both biologically and cognitively. Their brains are literally rewiring themselves.
Section 2, Cycle 4, concrete consolidation, the 9-year-old mind.
I want you to take a second and actually think back to being 9 years old. It's a really unique age, right? According to the developmental research framing the CNEB, this is a time characterized by rapidly declining egocentrism. Basically, before this, you're the center of the universe. But around 9, the world suddenly gets a lot bigger. Your social horizons expand way beyond just your parents and your siblings. You start looking around, deeply noticing your peers, noticing the community, and realizing that other people have entire inner lives that have absolutely nothing to do with you. It's a wonderful exploratory age, and kids build massive academic stamina here because they're just so hungry to figure out how this newly expanded world actually works.
So what's actually happening under the hood here? Well, in grade 4, kids are operating in what developmental psychologist Jean Piaget famously called concrete operations. Simply put, they need tangible objects and familiar context to process logic. You can't just hand them a high-level theory. You have to give them a physical example. This is exactly why math at this age isn't just arbitrary numbers on a page. It needs to be rooted in real-world stuff, like household economics or managing an allowance. This is also the pivotal moment where kids transition from the mechanics of learning to read to actually reading to learn. And morally, following Lawrence Kohlberg's theories, right and wrong are still viewed strictly through a lens of concrete consequences, punishment and reward. Fairness is highly literal. It's a very structured, rule-following phase of life.
Section 3, Cycle V, operational mastery, crossing the bridge.
Now, this transition we're crossing is the absolute aha moment of human development. We completely leave behind that rigid, concrete operational thought and the very localized social horizon of a 9-year-old. And suddenly, we cross the bridge into the wild territory of pre-abstract reasoning and this fierce, relentless pursuit of an autonomous social identity. Students are no longer just looking at the world exactly as it's physically presented to them. They're beginning to hold abstract ideas in their minds, twist them around, and ask, what if?
They aren't just a part of their family anymore either. They're actively building a separate, independent self.
The CNEB refers to this huge cognitive leap as pensamiento operativo, or operational thinking. This is where 10 to 12-year-olds unlock some serious cognitive firepower. They aren't just doing basic math anymore. They can handle quantitative reasoning with fractions and decimals, literally holding multiple operational relationships in their working memory at the exact same time. They also develop something called metalinguistic awareness. This means they can actually read a text, step back, critique the source, and evaluate an author's intent. Like, they actually start to realize when a commercial is trying to sell them something. In science, they move way past just observing leaves on the playground. Now they can design procedures and systematically test actual hypotheses. Their brains are leveling up in real time, giving them the raw tools for deep, critical thinking.
Section 4. The puberty threshold. Physical and emotional chaos.
Of course, all of this massive cognitive leaping doesn't just happen in a neat, tidy vacuum. Not at all. It happens right at the messy threshold of puberty. And this phase is an absolute whirlwind. Physically, you've got extreme growth spurts resulting in that classic, deeply relatable bodily awkwardness. We're talking kids literally waking up with longer limbs and not knowing quite how to use them. Socially, we see Albert Bandura's social learning dynamics kick into overdrive. Peer group centrality becomes the absolute rule of law. The approval of friends suddenly becomes like oxygen, heavily overriding family influence almost overnight. Group norms dictate behavior. And emotionally? Oh, it's intense volatility. It's a daily, sometimes hourly struggle as they kick off their search for a unique personal identity.
I think this perspective from the Peruvian Ministry of Education perfectly captures the sheer whiplash of being 11 years old. They describe it as periods of emotional instability and intense affective contrast, moving rapidly between feelings of independence and a need for adult reassurance. If you have ever lived with a preteen, you know this exact dynamic. One minute, they want total autonomy, roll their eyes and tell you they've got it all completely figured out. And the very next minute, they're entirely overwhelmed and desperately need a guiding adult hand to reassure them everything's going to be okay. It is an incredibly delicate, exhausting balancing act for the child.
Which brings us to a really critical question. How on earth do teachers actually manage this explosive growth? I mean, how do you write a functioning curriculum for a classroom where half the kids are still thinking in rigid, concrete terms, half are leaping wildly into the abstract, and absolutely everyone's emotions are on a roller coaster?
Section 5. Classroom Strategies for Growth, Pedagogical Implications.
To bridge this immense gap, educators operating under the CNB use 3 core strategies. They basically have to stack these together to successfully move kids from concrete experiences over to formal abstract thought. First, scaffolding competence-based learning. Second, differentiated instruction. And third, sociocultural mediation. Let's see how these brilliant strategies actually play out in action.
First up, scaffolding. Imagine trying to learn abstract algebra with absolutely no real-world anchor. It's terrifying and it's confusing. Because these learners are right in the middle of transitioning, teachers have to anchor these terrifying new abstract concepts in solid reality. In Peru, they heavily emphasize what they call situaciones significativas, meaningful, authentic, real-world situations. So instead of just teaching abstract math or science from a dry textbook, teachers use community projects, local environmental analyses, or financial literacy simulations. These concrete, local, highly familiar anchors give students a safe, recognizable place to stand while they stretch their newly forming minds into abstract conceptualization.
Next is differentiated instruction. Remember that physical and emotional chaos we just talked about? Maturation rates in middle childhood are highly uneven. A 10-year-old and a 12-year-old sitting right next to each other might be on completely different planets biologically. The CNEB dictates that learning environments must be flexible and incredibly sensitive to this reality. Inclusive practices, especially in physical education and personal social instruction, have to actively foster a positive body image and emotional well-being. The system forces educators to accommodate the biological reality of the student rather than forcing the student to fit some rigid system.
And finally, sociocultural mediation. What's truly fascinating here is how collaborative learning completely shifts its purpose between these two cycles. In cycle IV, around age 9, group work is basically about building pro-social norms, learning how to share, respect others, and essentially not drive each other crazy while completing a task. But in cycle V, teachers do something incredibly clever. They actually hijack that intense, sometimes annoying middle school need to constantly socialize. They deploy group work strategically to satisfy the developmental need for peer interaction, but they channel it within a highly structured, goal-directed framework. They're literally using a kid's overwhelming desire to be with their friends as the actual engine for academic learning. It's a brilliant pivot.
The level of intentionality here, mapping undeniable biological and cognitive realities directly onto everyday classroom strategies, is truly remarkable. It's a system that's designed to work with human nature, for sure, not against it. Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to consider today. Are we treating transitioning 10-year-olds like passive sponges? Or are we actively building bridges that respect and utilize their chaotic, incredible growth? Take a look at the schools in your own community. Which approach do you actually see playing out in the classrooms? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning how we guide the next generation of active minds.